Thank you, Dennis, and thanks to all of you for coming out to the lecture today. It's going to be fun for me, having been gone a little hiatus, chasing nutrients and algae all around Florida these past 5 years, right? But today I get to talk about one of my favorite places on the planet, Looe Key Reef in the lower Florida Keys. And the reason I've been able to study this reef over 4 decades is because I happen to have a home on Big Pine Key, up in the top part of the photo. And that allows me to get down there and in my Mako, get out to the reef and conduct this long-term, almost 4-decade study. So, you know, I go down there frequently. If I'm not here, I'm often down there. I like to think I'm a visiting scientist at the University of Big Pine Key. So, what I'd like to do is kind of start out the lecture with some of the background on Looe Key and the Florida Keys. I've been able to keep an eye on it, of course, for several decades now. And Looe Key, like coral reefs in the Caribbean and around the world, are going through these changes, global change. And it involves shifting from coral dominance to algae dominance. And so we're going to look at that very carefully and the role nutrients are playing in this so-called coral algal phase shift. We'll get into the data of the 3-decade study that we recently published in the journal Marine Biology, where we actually show how nitrogen has increased in the coastal waters of the Florida Keys, both from local and regional sources. And not only have the nutrients gone up, but the balance between the nutrients, what we call stoichiometry, the ratios of nitrogen and phosphorus have changed. And I'm going to end up talking about the Sargassum blooms. This has become the biggest algae bloom on Earth. Maybe some of you have been following the news in the Caribbean. This stuff is piling up on the beaches. It's having catastrophic effects, and it's affecting Florida as well. So I'll end up on that and then show a short video that I recently did for the Florida Chamber of Commerce that hits on some of the impacts on the business community in the Florida Keys. So while most of the talk is going to be about Looe Key, I actually had to go to some other places around the Caribbean and the world to really help inform my interpretation of what I was seeing happen at Looe Key Reef. Had to go to Jamaica, Belize. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it, right? So I'm going to include some of the work I've done in those 2 locations because they relate very directly to what we've seen happen at Looe Key. So Looe Key, where did it get its name? Now, I know what you're thinking, some of you, right? The British noun, loo, right? I know a lot of you know I work on septic tanks and sewage outfalls. Well, by the end of my lecture, you'll go, well, Looe, that's an appropriate name for this reef. But the reality is it was named after the HMS Looe, a British warship launched in 1741. Very late in the year, and it was only in service for about 2 years before it ran hard aground at Looe Key. And this history was written up by Mendel Peterson at the Smithsonian, a really nice little booklet on the HMS Looe. But one thing I love about Looe Key is our own Edwin Link did some salvage work on the Looe at Looe Key. And that photo on the far right, you can see Ed Link up there in the rigging on his sailboat, raising a 1-ton cannon. He's putting a block and tackle up there to raise a cannon from the bottom at Looe Key Reef, just showing you an amazing engineering genius he was. So the first study of corals in the Florida Keys, this is a very interesting part of the history, looking back now, was conducted by Louis Agassiz, a Swiss naturalist who was at Harvard University, and who was asked by the superintendent of the Coast Survey, the predecessor of NOAA, to go down to the Florida Keys and see what could be done about killing all the coral. Because back in the mid-1800s, there was a big industry in Key West. This is before Miami, the wrecking industry, right? And so all these merchant ships circumnavigating the Florida Keys were running up on these reefs with all this prolific coral, causing a real problem for the insurance companies that were insuring all that cargo. It was great for the people of Key West. Florida's first millionaire, William Curry, who was from Green Turtle Key, actually ran a ship's chandlery in Key West on Fleming Street and made a lot of money. And you can see his home today, the Curry Mansion in Key West. But anyway, after all this research, Louis Agassiz reported back that he doesn't see the possibility of limiting in any way the extraordinary increase of corals beyond the bounds which nature itself has assigned to their growth. Well, clearly he didn't know what was going to unfold in the next century, right? With the development of fertilizers to grow the world's population, and specifically the terraforming of Florida and the population growth in Florida. We're now the third most populous state in the United States and the #1 tourist destination in the world. So our research in the early days, this is John Ryther in this top left photo, myself in our Mako research vessel around 1985. In the 80s, we were very much involved. John and Dennis was involved in the work as well, looking at nutrients, algae for biofuels. And this is something a program that was started in the Carter administration. And we did a lot of aquaculture in South Pine Channel at Big Pine Key, growing algae, dosing them with nutrients. And that included these plants, the Sargassum fluitans and natans that comprise the floating Sargassum vegetation. And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk and show how the chemistry of those plants has changed, just like what we're going to see at Looe Key. So during the 80s, we were seeing these changes happening on coral reefs in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. And I began working with Mark and Diane Littler, who some of you may remember. They've lectured here a number of times in the past. They had done work in Hawaii in the 60s and 70s when during the development of Waikiki, Kaneohe Bay. And these were some of the first reefs that were studied in terms of this coral algal phase shift. And it was very clear from the research being done there that the two human factors that were contributing to these phase shifts were overfishing of herbivorous fish that eat algae, like parrotfish or surgeonfish, but also nutrients that fertilize the reef and make algae overgrow the corals. And the nutrients can have direct negative effects on the corals as well. So this is the relative dominance model that the Littlers published in the 80s, showing how going from high to low grazing corals can go to turf algae. And with high nutrients, they can go to the bigger seaweeds, the frondose algae, or high nutrients and high grazing to coral and algae. Well, I'm going to show a shifting baseline model. I've modified this a little bit based on my research to show that today what we're seeing in many cases due to elevated nutrients, that the corals are actually going towards dominance by these turf algae under high grazing pressure. So a lot of really what I'm talking about today is the nitrogen cycle, and we're just going to look at the top of the nitrogen cycle and how humans have greatly altered the nitrogen cycle. We've more than doubled the amount of reactive nitrogen on the planet through fertilizers to grow crops, to grow the world population. And of course, that population is producing waste as well that results in more nutrients. And if you look at the amount of nitrogen that we're releasing every year, these are the reactive forms like ammonium and nitrate as opposed to inert nitrogen in the atmosphere, N2. We're releasing about 120 million metric tons per year of reactive nitrogen and about 9 million metric tons of phosphorus per year. So if you look at the ratio of that, it's about 30 to 1, the molar ratio, the way we look at it as scientists. And that's higher than the Redfield ratio. Redfield was a very famous oceanographer at Woods Hole that actually my mentor, John Ryther, worked for Redfield. That ratio is 16 to 1, 16 nitrogen to 1 phosphorus. So that ratio of supply due to human sources is actually going up. And this is a big part of what we're seeing change at Looe Key, in the Sargassum, and actually beyond other reefs around the Caribbean. And in order to do this science, one of the things you need is really good analytical equipment to be able to measure things like ammonium, nitrate, and phosphate at part per billion concentrations. And there aren't that many labs that can do that. It's a picture of Looe Key back in the 1980s. We commonly had very clear water. Those two red dots at Looe Key are where we've been monitoring for 3 decades, actually going on 4 decades now, right in the middle of the FAU Reef, or the SPA, as they call it today, the Sanctuary Preservation or Protection Area. And then the evolution of our labs, that little TED shed is where we started in 1982 at Sea Camp. And then we needed more room, so I built a home on Big Pine Key, set up a lab in my downstairs where I had the Technicon auto analyzer, the instrument for nutrient analysis, a fluorometer to measure chlorophyll, the amount of algae in the water. And we moved that around up to Marathon at one point, to Crane Point Hammock. But we all along had that capability to measure these low-level nutrients, including that photo on the far right bottom is right here at Harbor Branch. In the 90s, our environmental lab actually got set up to run ultra-low-level nutrients as well. So in the 80s, I got to work with Mark and Diane Littler at the Smithsonian Field Station in Belize. This is what it looked like back in the day. And what we were working on were nutrient thresholds for coral reefs. So that relative dominance model, we wanted to know at what level of nitrogen and phosphorus do these coral reefs get overgrown by algae. Some of you may know that this kind of research was being done in the Everglades because phosphorus from farms and urban areas were increasing the phosphorus concentrations in the Everglades, just slight elevation, causing a shift from native sawgrass to cattails. Well, it's the same thing on coral reefs, okay? They're oligotrophic ecosystems like the Everglades. If you add nutrients, you're going to change the community, okay? So we began working on these gradients on the Great Barrier Reef, very pristine reef system at the time, from these high nutrient mangrove islands to these more what we call oligotrophic or low nutrient coral reefs. And here's dissolved inorganic nitrogen, soluble reactive phosphorus. You can see how they go down to undetectable levels at the most, remote, pristine coral reef here at Looe Key. And based on these nutrient gradient studies, we came up with a nutrient threshold for Caribbean reefs of about 0.5 micromolar to 1 micromolar. Now, that's a range, so if you average that, say it's 0.75 micromolar, that nitrogen concentration is the same as 10 parts per billion. And some of you may know that number. That's the phosphorus standard for the Everglades. That water coming into the Everglades protection area cannot have phosphorus higher than that because of the damage to those ecosystems. Meaning that coral reefs are really like the Everglades. They are impacted by increasing nutrients above these very low concentrations. So we also measured the nutrients in the algae at all these different sites we worked at. And I got to return recently to Belize and collect the algae again to do kind of a shifting baseline or a restudy. And what we found is that these red arrows are the baseline values from the 1980s at 4 different sites along that transect. And you can see the recent data are the bars, the colored bars, and you can see for the carbon and nitrogen ratio, they've all gone down. That means they're seeing more nitrogen. okay? And of course, we're seeing the symptoms of that. We're seeing macroalgae blooms now on the Great Barrier Reef, just like we've seen in the Florida Keys. For the carbon to phosphorus ratio down at the bottom, those ratios have gone up, meaning they're becoming more phosphorus limited. And this goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning. We're changing the stoichiometry. We're adding more nitrogen than phosphorus to these ecosystems. They're becoming more phosphorus limited as that nitrogen builds up in the system. Okay, Jamaica. I got invited there in 1987 to teach a marine botany course at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab. Wonderful facilities, immediate access to the beautiful reefs on the north coast of Jamaica. And like Belize, I got to return there in 2013 and kind of resample some of my study sites there. But this is a location where scientists from all over the world have come here to work. And a lot of this work has involved this studies of grazing, of the reef, of the algae by either sea urchins, like diadema, the long-spined urchin you see here, or parrotfish. And of course, the impacts of the Jamaican fishermen that use fish traps, right, and have overfished these reefs and removed these grazers. And this is, of course, where a lot of this research has come from, that we refer to as kind of top-down research, looking at how higher levels of the food web, these grazers, are influencing the ecosystem. The nutrients we refer to as bottom-up, right? They're feeding the algae and the corals from the bottom of the food web. So these were two very influential papers that really kind of pushed the idea that what was really causing these coral algal phase shifts in Jamaica was simply overfishing, and that nutrients weren't really playing a role. But there was a significant amount of research showing that these reefs were seeing elevated nitrogen from high nitrate groundwaters and river discharges. And so I ended up writing a kind of a follow-up paper that really, again, kind of brought back the relative dominance model that it's got to be a combination of reduced grazing by overfishing, but simultaneous nutrient enrichment by nitrogen in these environments. And that's turned out to be my most cited paper to date. I got to go back there, as I mentioned, in 2013 and compared the nitrogen content of this brown seaweed called Lobophora variegata from 1 meter depth all the way down to 36 meters. Of course, we collected these by diving, and you can see the blue line on that graph is the nitrogen content versus depth in 1987, and you can see how it has gone up by 2013, the red line. Almost 60 to 70% increase in the nitrogen content. So clearly this reef is seeing nitrogen inputs. We also got invited to work right around the corner from Discovery Bay at the Negril Marine Park. Negril was a little fishing village in the 1970s and 80s and began developing into a major tourist destination in the late 80s. And to me, coming from South Florida, it was a very interesting place to work. All the human activities, we're seeing expand in Florida were happening there on a much smaller scale. Mass tourism, urbanization, agriculture. And I got to train these reef rangers how to identify the algae, how to water sample. We began monitoring the new sewage ponds that you see in the bottom. That effluent was going into one of the rivers. And what we established was a monitoring program, what we call the Ridge to Reef, the first real Ridge to Reef monitoring program in the Caribbean. The South Negril River, North Negril River came up to these coastal mountains, and we monitored those all the way up. And then we had 6 sites in the Negril Marine Park, shallow and deep reefs. And it was really a great exercise working with the Jamaicans, the reef rangers. And what we found in the water column of the Negril Marine Park was that the nitrogen, again, the ammonium and nitrate levels were rising, and they were this is that range of that nitrogen threshold between 0.5 and 1 micromolar, averaging 0.75. You can see these reefs, which were undergoing this algal phase shift, were right there. The shallow reefs were higher than the deep reefs, both in the winter and summer in 1998 when we did that work. This is what the Jamaican reefs looked like during that time. You can see some corals being overgrown by algae. This green algae up at the top, codium. We've seen blooms of codium here in Florida on reefs downstream of some of the sewage outfalls off Broward in Palm Beach County. But a lot of these algae this is Sargassum, a benthic species, not to be confused with the floating species I'll be talking about. But you can see these reefs today look like kind of brown kelp forests, small kelps, that color the reef brown, meadows of this brown algae. So what we've seen happen in Jamaica is that algae have largely replaced corals there, okay? And the main type of algae are these larger macroalgae or seaweeds. This is Sargassum, benthic Sargassum, comprise about 65% of the reef these days or more, with these other types of algae, the little filamentous algal turfs, about 12%, and the crustose coral and algae, about 10%. So that's a coral algal phase shift that was one of the first reefs in the Caribbean to go through this kind of shift. And this is the model I now use rather than the relative dominance model to kind of depict these changes over time, where we see with increasing nutrients, we see the relative abundance of coral decrease, and that's due both, again, to the direct effects of nitrogen reducing the growth of corals, calcification, reproduction, but simultaneously fertilizing the algae, particularly in this case the macroalgae. And this is under a low grazing scenario where you don't have a lot of those parrotfish and surgeonfish eating and grazing on the reef. So coming back to South Florida, by 1990, we knew we were having these same types of problems in Florida Bay and on coral reefs of the Florida Keys. And this was a key issue of National Geographic magazine that I was approached to review one of the articles by Fred Ward called "The Coral Reefs of Florida Are Imperiled." So we were seeing increasing algae, decreasing coral. And this is the quote that was included in that article attributed to me, that nutrient pollution is pushing Florida's reefs beyond their ability to survive. Cleaning up the sewage in the Florida Keys would be a major step in the right direction, and agricultural pollution should be kept away from the Keys reefs. Well, that article certainly helped spur the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Act of 1990 that set up the sanctuary in the Florida Keys. And it brought in a multi-agency effort specifically to put together a water quality protection plan. And it's interesting because 2 years earlier in 1988, we had a workshop in Key Largo sponsored by NOAA to look at coral reef research and management needs for the Florida Keys, a blueprint for action. And of course, the scientists there all agreed that nutrients were the key issue because of what was happening in other places like Jamaica. And Jim Miller, who organized the meeting and published this report, is going to be in the video we'll look at later in the talk. But it was clear that water quality, everyone agreed in the Florida Keys at that time that this was the major concern. How do we clean up the waters that were already starting to turn green in Florida Bay with algae blooms? So no sooner did the sanctuary get passed, the act, it began to be implemented in 1991 and 1992, when the Sanctuary Advisory Council chair, George Barley, who some of you may know was the founder of the Everglades Foundation, He brought into one of these sanctuary meetings a scientist from University of Virginia who argued that, well, there wasn't really a water quality problem. We just need a hurricane to clean out the system. That would go over real well today, right? And he went on to say, well, if there is a problem, we just need to send more Lake Okeechobee water down to Florida Bay. Right, huh? Well, that's what they did. It was amazing, to be in the Keys and watch this all unfold, telling the public in the Florida Keys that we're here to fix your problem. We're going to bring Lake Okeechobee water down here. And they did it. Between 1991 and 1995, a huge amount of water came down through the Everglades into Florida Bay and into the Florida Keys region. And this is a Miami Herald article showing this dead zone that occurred. This is 1992. After 2 years of increased flows, the algae blooms had worsened. You can see Miami Herald right there calling it a dead zone because of all the algae blooms and low oxygen. And a lot of this water, most of it is coming down Shark Slough through the central Everglades. Now, a little bit of it's coming Taylor Slough, that other arrow, into the Central Bay. But the fact that this is the quote in the article that most scientists blame a shortage of fresh water that once flowed from the Everglades, when in fact there was more water coming into the bay. So what do we call that today? Fake news, right? So this is the reality. This is the data, okay, of what has really happened with water flows to the Everglades. You've heard it. The Army Corps of Engineers drained the Everglades and the national park is starved for water, right? Well, they did drain the Everglades a century ago. However, the water flows since the 50s have been increasing, especially in the period of time I'm talking about from 1983 on. You can see how those flows have increased over time. And during the 1983 to 2017 period, an average about 750,000 acre-feet of water have gone down through Shark Slough to the Gulf of Mexico, down to the Florida Bay, Florida Keys region. But years like 1995, when they want to deliver more water, and we have a wet year on top of that, 3 million acre-feet of water, 3 million acre-feet of water went down, probably the most water that's ever gone down through Shark Slough into the coastal ocean. So the other thing you hear a lot, we should send the Lake O discharges to Florida Bay. Florida Bay needs more water. Well, problem is the bulk of the water coming through the central Everglades is coming down Shark Slough. It comes out into the Gulf of Mexico above Cape Sable over here. Look at the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of the water. Do you remember the Redfield ratio, 16 to 1? 260 to 1. Okay? So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. That water coming down Shark Slough does not go into Florida Bay. It comes out onto the west side of Florida Bay and beyond. This is after that 3 million acre-feet of water came down in 1995. What you're looking at is an algae bloom in turbidity that extends all the way from Shark Slough, the discharge area up here, all the way through the back country of the Keys, that's the Marquesas, all the way out to Dry Tortugas. And you can see this turbid green water coming through the tidal channels to the outer reefs. This other satellite image is an example of another major freshwater release in 2013. You all may remember we had the blue-green algae blooms in the St. Lucie estuary that year, very wet July, and they were releasing water from Lake Okeechobee into the estuary. Well, a lot of water was also going south. That was the year they finished the C-111 Western Diversion Project, bringing more water right down into the central part of Florida Bay. Two examples there of how these very high flows create cyanobacterial blooms in Florida Bay, blue-green algae. So, not surprising, the idea of the sanctuary and the associated agencies telling the people of the Florida Keys, we're here to help you. We're going to bring more water down from Lake Okeechobee. it hasn't gone over very well with the people of the Florida Keys. They really didn't trust that the federal government was going to do the right thing. I think they had enough common sense to realize in the wet season the water gets greener than the dry season when it clears up, and they knew more water was not going to be good for either the seagrasses or the coral reefs of the Florida Keys. And these were tumultuous times. This was 1992 when the sanctuary was having these stakeholder meetings, and there was a group called the Conch Coalition. These were commercial fishermen, treasure salvers, people that work on the water and could tell that this is not going to play out well for the Florida Keys. So they hung 3 sanctuary officials in effigy. That's Billy Causey, George Barley, and John Ogden, the one scientist on the Sanctuary Advisory Council. So that kind of brings us to my study, my 30-year study, and I'm going to talk about how water releases coming down, again, the Shark River. We've measured nutrients along this gradient coming down to Looe Key down here. Also going to show a little bit about the rock pile reef that's on the bay side of Big Pine Key. But basically this reef has gone, during my lifetime, during my career, from being dominated by branching corals, elkhorn coral, to today that same habitat has flattened, and it's basically dominated by this one organism, Palaethoa, on the very shallow reef, a zoanthid, a little bit of Halimeda algae there. But of course, all the schools of fish that you once had living in and about that three-dimensional coral habitat are gone. Even in a sanctuary protection area where there's no fishing, the fish have gone down because of the loss of that habitat. This is how the nitrogen, the green bar, over the 30-year study spiked in the early 90s when the flows from Shark River were increased quite dramatically here. This is the nitrogen going up right after the sanctuary was formed. And here's that 1 micromolar threshold. Basically, they pushed it over the tipping point for a healthy coral reef. You can see back in the 1980s, we were still in a relatively healthy condition, averaging around 0.5 or lower. And particularly in the drought year here, 1990, were some of the lowest nitrogen concentrations we had. This is the chlorophyll A, the phytoplankton in the water, the green water effect. You can see it follows the flow from Shark River very tightly. It too, just like the nitrogen, has about doubled on average. It was averaging about 0.1 micrograms per liter back in the 80s, and it's averaging above 0.2 these days. That's why the tourist brochures in the Florida Keys now describe the water not as gin clear anymore, it's emerald green, like the emeralds on the Etosha, right? This is what the water looks like today. This is Cape Sable up here. You can see the brownish tint in the water. That's water coming out of Shark Slough. This is the Western Bay, the bald eagle, the national park boat out of Flamingo. And this is the cyanobacterial bloom coming out of the tidal channels of the Florida Keys towards the outer reef. This was a shot at the peak of the flows, 1995, on a reef off Key West, offshore. You can see how green that water was. That's the year the chlorophyll peaked. But not just those algae blooms, we actually had real toxic red tides in the Florida Keys in that peak year in 1995. Killed a tremendous amount of fish and wildlife in the Keys. And then some of you may know Mark Caputo, who writes for Politico now. He was with a Key West Citizen back in the day and said, maybe the Bay remedy is backfiring. Maybe, it's not making these algae blooms go away. Maybe it's making things worse. And it wasn't just algae blooms, but bacteria, just like we see in the St. Lucie estuary and the Caloosahatchee. When more water comes in from the lake or the basin itself with the rainy season, all those septic tanks and other sources, the fecal bacteria go up. And we were seeing this now from all the organic matter, from the algal blooms. The beaches were getting shut down. Not that we're known for great beaches in the Florida Keys, but the few beaches we have, the tourists couldn't swim, and it was causing a real economic crisis for the Florida Keys. And that problem actually went all the way out to the Tortugas. You saw that satellite image of the plume going all the way out. And macroalgae, the seaweeds on the bottom, were blooming as well. You can see this is an article, the Miami Herald, the Keys edition, showing these red seaweeds were rolling like tumbleweed across the bottom. Again, in the plume, a Shark River coming down here, coming under the 7 Mile Bridge. And also to the west of Key West, between the Marquesas, another type of seaweed, brown seaweeds, that were blooming there, overgrowing and causing hypoxia, low oxygen conditions, and killing coral as well. These are some of the macroalgae that have bloomed in the Florida Keys around Big Pine Key. You can see 1989. I know it's hard to believe, but that's me. I used to have hair. And look at that. That is gin clear water, okay? That was really one of the last years our water quality was really good before the big flush. This was the same year up in Florida Bay, showing that water in Florida Bay. We were already seeing algae blooms in Florida Bay. But by 2008, after the big water releases of the 90s, the corals, this is the rock pile I mentioned just north of the Content Keys, these magnificent brain corals that were centuries old just died within a few years because of the water quality issues. And these are red algae on the south side of the lower Keys near Little Palm Island. Again, these patch reefs are pretty much toast. There's very little living coral cover left. They've been overgrown by algae, including this species, Bryothamnion, that is a very high nitrogen plant. And we've really never seen that out there before, up until just in recent years. And I just point out that our reefs do have a lot of grazers, unlike reefs in Jamaica. So a place like Looe Key, these are all photos from Looe Key. The problem we're seeing with decreasing coral is certainly not due to overfishing of grazers. In fact, the grazers, we think, have probably gone up over time. So we're coming back to the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio and the balance, okay, of nutrients and how we're altering that. These are macroalgae at Looe Key, N to P ratio averaged for the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010. You can see how that N to P ratio jumped from a value of about 20, 25 in the 80s up to 70 or so with all that water coming down, okay? Remember that 260 to 1 in that water? This affected the entire region. So when we look at the 30 years of data, of course, we looked at a lot of data. A lot of people were concerned that isn't temperature killing the reefs? Well, in our data, and this is temperature data from Looe Key itself, it's pretty much flatlined. We've seen many years over 30 years when the temperature was over 30.5 degrees, that red line, which is the temperature threshold for coral bleaching. But it was only where these yellow bands occurred that we saw mass bleaching throughout the Florida Keys on the offshore bank reefs. And those events all followed major water releases when the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio went up, okay? This just shows the nitrogen over time going up, and it really jumped up again in the 1990s, just like the N to P ratio in the algae. We see the phosphorus take a little dip here because that bloom, all that green water, is a phosphorus-limited bloom. There's more nitrogen than phosphorus, so it's stripping the phosphate out of the water, further raising the N to P ratio. So when we look at the statistics over time, over the 30 years, the coral cover has gone down significantly as an effect of increasing dissolved inorganic nitrogen. Here's that 1 micromolar value. And the chlorophyll A, the amount of algae in the water, it has gone up as the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio has gone up. And this, I just realized we did a study just before the Sanctuary Act was passed and before the big break point occurred in the 1990s. This study right here was conducted in 1989, 1990. And we got to survey all the reefs of the Keys from Key Largo all the way down to Key West, the Bank Reefs, 6 sites. The average DIN-SRP ratio, or the N-to-P ratio, was about 7:1. And those were during drought years when there was very little runoff from land. And that's a value you would typically see on a very healthy coral reef. So you saw how high the algae went at Looe Key, up to 70:1. These are the DIN-SRP ratios for the sanctuary monitoring program. Here's Florida Bay, 160:1, that bright pink. But even the lower Keys around Big Pine, we're seeing values upwards of almost 100. And the Bank Reefs up to, 80 or so, which again really supports what we found in the algae and in our water sampling, a completely independent data set. Those are super, super high N-to-P ratios. And here's the problem. We now know that these high N-to-P ratios starve the corals for phosphorus. They need phosphorus for their metabolism. The lipids, the phospholipids used in their photosynthetic membranes, they end up having to substitute sulfur. And it doesn't work so well, and it creates photooxidative stress. And this is why they get expelled. This is really what's stressing the corals, making them super sensitive to high temperature and high light when these ratios go up like that. And again, that's why we see the coral bleaching following these periods of major water releases when those N-to-P ratios go up. 1987. 10 years later, November, look at this. This bleaching in 97 happened in the fall and winter when we didn't even really have warm temperatures. And then again in September 2014, you saw that big plume, the algae bloom in 2013. That was a major event that brought a lot of high nitrogen into these waters. And of course, it increases the susceptibility of corals to diseases as well. Black band disease, yellow band, aspergillosis, this disease on that sea fan, is actually a soil fungus. White pox disease, and what we now are calling stony coral tissue loss disease. We're seeing another outbreak right now in the Florida Keys in the past couple of years, following all these wet years we've had, and we know that that's what's been behind the algae blooms we've seen in the St. Lucie estuary, the Indian River Lagoon, and the Caloosahatchee. So the monitoring over time has shown as the water flows have gone up, so has the annual rate of coral decline. You can see these corals, again, this is the rock pile, how from the 80s they have died over time. Sadly, the Florida Keys was declared a dead zone in 2003 as a result of these algae blooms and the low oxygen conditions. Some of our oxygen data on the right for Looe Key and the nearshore areas show both anoxia and hypoxia in many of these habitats. So this is what's happened at Looe Key. We've had this coral algal phase shift, but in our case, the phase shift has included algal turf more than macroalgae, very different than Jamaica. So this is our shifting baseline with increasing nutrients. Coral has gone down, and algal turf, because of the high numbers of grazers in this system, are now dominating the limestone hard bottom at Looe Key. Interestingly, a recent review by John Bruno has shown that a lot of these marine protected areas that set up spas like Looe Key to limit consumptive activities, removal of grazers, haven't been working. They're not increasing the live coral on reefs or increasing reef resilience, okay? In 18 different case studies, really no real positive effects of these marine protected areas are showing positive results. And I think everyone's realizing now it's all about the water. And this was certainly the message that we brought out in our 30-year paper. I just wanted to give a shout out to some of the media coverage we got, not just the Key West Citizen, finally a headline that mainland runoff, not just the sewage in the Florida Keys, is contributing to the decline we're seeing in the Florida Keys, but also the NBC Nightly News team with Kerry Sanders that did a really, really great show back in September on our research. And just to close up now, the last couple slides here are about these massive sargassum blooms that we're now seeing in the Caribbean and here in Florida as well. These are just some pictures. Barbados, that was 2015, Martinique, Guadeloupe. They're causing really big problems for tourism, obviously, and economic harm, but also environmental harm, causing dead zones and human health impacts due to the hydrogen sulfide that's coming off all this rotting biomass. These blooms started really worsening in 2011. You can see how they've built up seasonally in the central Atlantic Ocean. These are some remote sensing images just showing this bloom really beginning to stretch from Africa towards the Caribbean and worsening over the years, with the biggest one to date in 2018, when it stretched all the way from the west coast of Africa across the central Atlantic in through the Caribbean up into the Gulf of Mexico, 8,850 kilometers, the biggest algae bloom on Earth. And we have been monitoring sargassum off Looe Key since the early 1980s, 1983, 84 data right here. This is more recent data since the Deepwater Horizon spill. You can see the very significant increase in the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. These plants are seeing more nitrogen, so that effect we're seeing in our coastal waters, it's going beyond the reef. It's going out into blue water where these floating seaweeds are getting enriched by it, and it's increasing their growth. Look at this value. That's Western Florida Bay. That's that Shark River water. Remember, 260 to 1 NP ratio? This is 80, okay? So that shows us the source of the water that's feeding those sargassum blooms. So that water coming south in the Florida Bay, Florida Keys region, it's actually going out and helping to feed these blooms as they come up through the Florida current. If we look at the Gulf of Mexico values over here we've measured recently, you can see all these values are higher than the values we measured both at Looe Key and in our big survey back in 1986-87 of the Sargasso Sea, the Caribbean region. So this is real, ladies and gentlemen. We are changing the chemistry on the planet. Here's the Amazon way over here. You've heard about all the deforestation and the fires. This is, we believe, one of the significant new sources of nitrogen, high nitrate loading that is increasing, feeding that bloom in the central Atlantic Ocean. And like I said, in the last couple of years, it's starting to impact us to the point where Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County now are beginning to develop management plans. So with that, I'm gonna, let's see, I think we're gonna go into this short video. It's just about 4 minutes long. Studies at Looe Key Reef extend back 35 years and show that the amount of algae in the water has on average doubled at Looe Key since 1984. This is a result of increasing nitrogen in the water that can be traced to local sources in the Florida Keys such as sewage, but also non-point source nitrogen coming from the Everglades Basin that extends north all the way to Orlando.
In 1988, I organized a workshop entitled Results of a Workshop on Coral Reef Research and Management in the Florida Keys. The number one problem, in the opinion of the whole group, was nutrients coming from the north.
As these new waters made their way into Florida Bay, there started to be a significant unintended consequence associated with algae blooms, and the impacts to Florida Bay were wide-ranging.
When I used to dive back in the earlier days, we wouldn't dive unless visibility was probably 70 to 100 foot, and that was real common. Nowadays, we're diving, if it's 20 foot of visibility, it's good. We would have never gotten in the water back in those days.
Simply dumping more water into the Everglades and ultimately into Shark Slough would do very little to provide benefit to Florida Bay and could very well cause unintended harm to the reef track.
What you clearly see from the data is every time you dump more water into Florida Bay from the north, you get larger algal blooms.
There's also a lot of development and a lot of historic septic tank use all around Florida Bay. And with sea level rise, we're getting into the drain field.
Down in Key Haven, off of Key West, which has had sewers from the day one when they first did it, the canals in there were like I remember they used to be. You could see the bottom, they were full of fish.
The economic development people saw, I mean, they clearly understood that if we've got poor water quality problems, they're going to have trouble attracting tourists. The only way we were going to address them was to go to a central wastewater system that had advanced wastewater treatment.
So regionally, the Lake Okeechobee watershed plan needs to be funded and implemented, which calls for increased storage and treatment of water north of Lake Okeechobee. That will help protect not only Lake Okeechobee, but also the downstream waters of Florida Bay and the Florida Keys.
We can do a lot better than what we've done. It can be better. If everybody would just back up and look at this thing objectively, have sound science, I think we could start at least moving in that direction.
And the property values. Our little conch house has gone up in value, and it's in part because of what we've done to clean up our water and treat it properly.
I'm kind of key-centric. I care about this area. It's where I've been for many, many years. It's my community, and I care very deeply about it. But I also understand that it's an interconnected environment. So if it's bad up north and they choose to send it south, we're the ones that suffer. Now, like I say, I'm sympathetic, but I'm not so sympathetic that I want their water. I don't want to share their water. I want them to fix their water.
So I just want to close up and thank all my sponsors over many years that I've been doing this, that have supported the research at Looe Key, and also my colleagues. These are my colleagues that were on the 30-year study with me: Laura Heron, Jim Porter, Chunmin Hu, and of course my current research coordinator, Rachel Bruton. That has just been awesome. And last but not least, Brian Cousin, who's been part of my program, helping me to edit the videos like you just saw. And with that, I do want to point out that we have the long-term Looe Key video and the rock pile video available on YouTube if any of you want to look at how those coral reefs have changed over time. And with that, thank you very much.